thanks a lot once again, Professor Salvatore Babon, joining us from Australia, Sydney. You're working as associate professor, a comparative sociologist. It's a wonderful possibility for us at the platform of RESO having such a wonderful personality. We invite people with dexterity from different domains, and you are one of such a leading sociologist, a comparative sociologist. Once again, a very warm welcome to you. So I would like to start with my first question, which is a very important question even in today's context. It says Indian democracy is currently undergoing a significant transformation, raising the question of whether there is a presence of democratic spiritualism as envisioned by Swami Vivekananda.
I don't know how much democratic spiritualism there is. That has been a goal not only from Vivekananda, but in the BJP's own antecedents through Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, who wrote extensively about this idea that democracy being essentially good for the soul. It's an idea that resonates throughout Indian writing on democracy in a way that's different from American writing, which tends to focus much more on procedural issues. Whether India has achieved it or not, I don't know. It's an idealistic approach to what democracy should be, but I don't think it represents what democracy is in any country. In practice, what democracy is cobbling together a vote from people who have disparate interests and disparate reasons for voting. I think it's important that the idealistic component be there rhetorically. So when I say that it's just rhetoric and it's not in reality, I don't say that disparagingly. I say that because that's the way it should be. Right? That we need to have inspiring thoughts about what we're doing as a democratic political community, even if in reality the voting is based on day-to-day issues like taxation rates or public services or corruption investigations. Even if that's the truth, we have to think our democracy means something more than that. And I think that's the important role that thinkers like Swami Vivekananda play in Indian democracy, and it's the role that thinkers like Thomas Jefferson played in American democracy. It's important to have ideals, even if you don't live up to them.
So thanks a lot responding to this beautiful question with really a comparative approach of sociology. And it's like what I figure out is kind of, of course we're learning and sort of you address democracy, but from a sociological perspective, once again, thanks a lot. So would like to move on to my second question, which is again an important question. It says, Indian Prime Minister Modi is being unfairly portrayed as a fascist, with Indian intellectuals contributing to this misleading narrative. Do you agree with it?
There is absolutely nothing fascist about Narendra Modi. I'm sorry if I laugh when I say that, but I think fascism is often used as a generic political insult by people who have no understanding of actual fascism and how it worked. Fascism is a totalitarian ideology in which a party in Italy, originally the fascist party in Italy, the fascist party of Benito Mussolini. In Germany, of course, it was the Nazi party of Adolf Hitler. In Russia, it was the Communist Party of Lenin and Stalin. But in each of these cases, there are totalitarian regimes. And all three of these totalitarian regimes share common features, as famously recognized by the Jewish German philosopher Hannah Arendt, but also by people even at the time in the 1930s and 40s who were writing about the similarities between these regimes. These regimes all had what are called strong party systems in which the party controlled everything. So every aspect of life was conducted within the party. Now, you could say that there's some echoes of that in the way that the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, is on the one hand, it is a volunteer organization, but it has a youth group, it has a religious group, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, it has a labor union, it has a political party, the BJP, and you could make that comparison to fascism in that, well, Benito Mussolini's fascists had a fascist youth group, a fascist political party, a fascist labor union. But that's where the similarity ends. And the big difference is that in fascism, there is no tolerance for alternative mechanisms. So the only way that we could call the BJP fascist would be if they outlawed non-RSS labor unions, if they outlawed non-RSS youth groups, if they outlawed non-RSS women's organizations, if they outlawed non-RSS religious organizations. I mean, Adolf Hitler literally created a fascist Lutheran church and prohibited the established Lutheran church from operating and replaced it with his fascist Lutheran church. There's nothing like that in India or associated with the BJP or with the person of Narendra Modi. Now, I understand that many people dislike Narendra Modi, and that's fine. Of course, you can like or dislike any particular political leader. Many people dislike the BJP, and again, that's fine. You can like or dislike a political party. But the fact that you dislike a political party or its form of organization or its agenda, or you think the party is too successful, it doesn't make it fascist, right? I mean, that word has really deep and troubling connections to things like war, genocide, complete disregard for international norms, and that's simply not what we see in India today, or in any prospective India in the future. Let me just make one last observation. Fascism in Europe was intimately connected with aggressive war, meaning that every fascist regime, in order to validate and legitimize its rule, immediately started wars with other countries. And that started with Mussolini. Mussolini became the fascist dictator of Italy in the early 1920s. He immediately invaded Ethiopia. He invaded Libya. He invaded Albania. He invaded Greece. Right? I mean, he didn't succeed in most of those. He was a very poor military leader. But nonetheless, his regime depended on external aggression to legitimize itself at home. And that's because Italians did not view him as their elected leader, elected through due process. He could only maintain his legitimacy by always uniting Italians around this external war. Hitler did the same thing. Hitler came to power. What does he do? He invades, Austria, he invades Czechoslovakia, he invades Poland, he starts World War II. What happened in Russia the minute that the Soviets came to power in Russia? They invaded Poland, they invaded Ukraine and conquered it. They invaded Finland, they invaded the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They invaded, for that matter, there was a war between the Soviet Union and Japan over Mongolia. They invaded Mongolia. So again, this is a pattern that's so intimately connected with fascism, and people might say that Narendra Modi and the BJP have acted aggressively in a strike against terrorists in Pakistan. That simply doesn't compare. On top of that, I have every reason to believe that a Congress government in India would have done the same. That is, any rational, patriotic government in India would have struck out against foreign terrorists who are attacking the country. There's no evidence of the use of war as a legitimating tool in India, and that's a core part of what it means, or it's a core corollary of what happens when you have a fascist regime.
Thanks a lot once again, Professor Babon, for giving us this deep insight about India not being a fascist state, because fascism is all talking about, as per your words, and understanding authoritarian leadership, and it's a different pitch altogether, which I figure out. And thanks a lot once again. Would like to move on to my third question. Again, important question. It says, is it accurate to assert that India under Modi's leadership is experiencing a recession of democracy, particularly in light of the decline in India's global democracy ranking?
Very close to me, because I've been spent 5 years researching this very topic. I've seen virtually no objective evidence that there has been any decline in the quality of India's democracy over the last 10 years. There's lots of subjective feeling among intellectuals that there's been a decline in the quality of India's democracy, but that decline seems to only be occurring specifically in those areas that cannot be objectively verified. In every area that we're able to objectively verify, there does not seem to be any decline in the quality of Indian democracy. Now, that's not the same as saying that there are no problems of Indian democracy. There are serious challenges facing Indian democracy, but those challenges predated 2014, and those challenges continue today. If I were to criticize Mr. Modi and the BJP, my main criticism in terms of the quality of democracy would be that they have used the same tools that were used by the Congress government before them. That is, they've used the UAPA, they've used the enforcement directorate, they've selective prosecutions. That is, they've done all the same things that Congress did. Now, that's not to say that they're good. They're certainly wrong. They were wrong when Congress did them. They're wrong when the BJP does them. The question is, for me as a social scientist, has there been any increase in these problems of democracy? And in every area where I'm able to check the qualitative impression against quantitative data. So, I can check things like safety and security for journalists. I can check things like the levels of academic freedom and number of academics who've lost their jobs. I can check things like the competitiveness of elections. I can check things like the numbers of prosecutions of political opponents. So whenever we get to the numbers on any of these issues, there seems to be virtually no change. Now, that in itself is an indictment because we'd like to see improvement. Right? I think every government should have the goal, not just of being no worse than the politicians before. That's a pretty modest goal. We'd like to have politicians who want to see their countries reach ever higher levels of moral perfection. We started off by talking about the moral quality of democracy. The BJP talks a good talk about the moral quality of democracy. It would be fantastic if the party did more to live up to that rhetoric instead of simply replicating the kinds of tactics that have been used in India ever since the Congress era. Every time a BJP leader points and says, well, Congress did this too, well, that may be correct, but it's not morally uplifting. And if you read the BJP's rhetoric, the party clearly aspires to being a morally uplifting party. I don't think it's living up to that noble objective. But that said, it's not doing anything worse than previous governments have done, and by the international norms of democracy, it's not doing anything that other democracies don't do. That is, when I benchmark India's democracy against other high-quality democracies, it looks very similar. There are abuses and problems, but they're the same abuses and problems that we see in other countries. And that's something that's not reflected on the VDEM rankings, the Variety of Democracy Institute rankings, which have become the globally dominant rankings. But there are other rankings. So the globally dominant ranking until 2014 was a ranking project called the Polity 5 project. The Polity 5 project ranked countries, or rated countries, I should say, on a series of dimensions related to democracy. And the scale they use runs from -10 for complete dictatorship to +10 for the highest qualities of democracy. India is rated by the Polity project as a +9. The Australia here where I live gets a +10. The United States, my home country, gets a +8. So is Indian democracy somewhere roughly on the level of Australian or American democracy? I think the Polity project pretty much gets it correct. That is, that broad evaluation that India is a democracy of the same quality as a typical Western democracy. Yeah, I think that's correct. Is it a perfect democracy? No. But does anyone think America is a perfect democracy? Well, no one I've ever talked to thinks that America is a perfect democracy. But remember those words from the American Constitution. In order to create a more perfect union. That's the goal of our Constitution. And I would hope in India there's the same goal. The goal to make a more perfect India. Not to make a perfect India. To make a more perfect India. And as long as Indians pursue that goal, Indians are doing just as well and falling short in the same ways as other democracies around the world.
Thank you so much once again, Professor Babon, giving your thoughts on this important issue, because this is always important, but our evidence, our analysis matters and differs to what extent? That's one of the question, and specifically because I'm also a sociologist. So, our comparative sociological approaches to various social pathologies and evils are important at times to draw some right conclusions and authentic and appropriate scientific conclusions. That's what I smell and figure out in
Yeah.
your.
Can I actually comment on something there? Part of the problem with the VDEM project is that it's not a comparative project. Instead, it evaluates each country separately using in-country experts who evaluate specifically that country. And then wherever the country falls on the score, well, that's its score. And of course, we tend to then rank countries based on its score. My own impression is that those scoring India score it much harder and more aggressively than people who score European countries, or especially Ireland and New Zealand get very high scores that I don't think they deserve, because there's a broad consensus in Ireland and New Zealand around, among the elites in Ireland and New Zealand, around the character of their democracy. In India, the character of democracy is highly contested, meaning that it gets much more aggressively scored on the same metrics. What VDEM does not do is international comparisons. So what I'm doing in my own research is, instead of trying to evaluate India in isolation and then evaluate Australia in isolation, evaluate Indonesia in isolation, I'm saying, let's compare India against other countries. I don't know how good India's democracy is. That's something you have to ask God. What's the true level of democracy in India? I know that India is pretty similar to developed countries' democracies. And I know that because every dimension I look at, instead of trying to evaluate it on an absolute scale, low to high, I'm trying to benchmark it against how things are done in other countries. And I find that things in India are done in a similar way to the way things are done in other, much more highly developed democracies. And that's the basis of my understanding. It's a comparative as opposed to a specialist country understanding of the democracy evaluations.
Thanks a lot. Again, a deeper insight, a different perspective we see. Now, I would like to move on to my fourth question. It is an important question, and this is one of the question you being interviewed on this topic, on this question before also, and we thought we should certainly take an interview of you and have some time and your comments. And we see an expansion, further expansion of sociology in this question. And as you responded in your previous interview, we could trace certainly a better possibility for the expansion of sociology. And the question is this way: it says the consecration of Ayodhya Temple Ram Mandir was previously described in your interview as a sociological change rather than a political one. Could you please elaborate on this theory, as it represents an expansion of sociological possibility rather than a political possibility?
You may remember back in February, there was a lot of discussion of India entering a new era of a Ram Rajya, a government in the spirit of Lord Ram and according to the principles embraced by Lord Ram. And there's also a lot of talk about the Bhagavad Gita and India representing the principles of the Bhagavad Gita in its political constitution. I don't mean the literal written constitution, I mean in the political structures of the country. And that really is about what India means as a nation, which is distinct from what India means as a state. The state is what we elect people to represent us in the state institutions, and they control the levers of power at the state. That's different from what constitutes a nation. And really what the Ram Mandir consecration, the big effect it had was on Indians' sense of what constituted the Indian nation. I think Narendra Modi, who participated directly in the consecration, was very careful to say that the Ram Mandir was not only for Hindus, but it was to give direction or give a sense, give a moral compass to all Indians of whatever faith they were. Now, it's not for me to decide whether that's right or wrong, appropriate or inappropriate, whether people want to accept Ram as a guiding figure or they don't want to accept him. That's for Indians to decide. For me as a social scientist, the interesting fact is that it's a claim about what constitutes the Indian nation and the principles on which the Indian nation will be formed. It says nothing about the government of India. The government of India remains completely secular. The government of India is governed by the Indian Constitution. There's no religious foundation for India's state institutions. But of course, state institutions don't exist in a vacuum. They exist within a national context. Indian state institutions will differ in character from Indonesian state institutions because Indonesia's state institutions are informed by the almost nationwide infusion of Islam in the country, so that although its state institutions may be secular, and there's some question about that today, there's been some compromises around the secularity of Indonesian state institutions, but although its state institutions may be secular, the nation itself is a highly Muslim nation. Or perhaps a better example, Japan is a syncretic Buddhist and Shinto nation. Japan's state institutions are entirely secular. There's no vestige of Buddhist or Shinto ceremony in Japan's state institutions. Yet the nation, the spirit of the nation, is strongly informed by Buddhist and Shinto beliefs about how people should behave in public life. So the Ram Mandir the consecration ceremony was really about how Indians should behave in public life, at least one vision, let's face it, the BJP's vision, or more broadly, the RSS's vision of how Indians should behave in public life. But that's a vision that is widely shared by many in India, and not only by Hindus. I mean, there are many Hindus who object to that vision, and there are at least some Muslims and Christians who embrace that vision and who think of it as a noble vision for India, even if it's not drawn from their particular religious experience. Okay. But I insisted at the time that the Ram Mandir had very little political importance, and in fact, it seems to have had no effect whatsoever on the elections, the 2024 elections in India. Yes, it was a popular move, especially among India's Hindus at the time in February, but that was 4 months before the election. The political importance really isn't there. On top of that, there were a lot of fears because Narendra Modi himself participated in the consecration ceremony, which I'm on record as saying from a democratic perspective was a mistake. That is, he being the prime minister of the country should not also have worn that separate hat and participated in the consecration ceremony. He chose to. That's his decision. But despite his decision to participate in the consecration ceremony, there's been no systematic role of the Ram Mandir in Indian governance because there's no institutional place for it. It's even different from, say, the United Kingdom, where the Westminster Abbey, plays a ceremonial role in the British state. So even the United Kingdom, which is a secular country, which is Western, which is progressive, all these kind of adjectives, the religious institution of Westminster Abbey plays a larger role in the state than any temple, including the Ram Mandir, plays in the Indian state. And so fears that this would create some kind of theocratic connection to the state, I think those were wildly overblown, completely unfounded, precisely because the influence is not political. The influence is social. It's about the construction of the nation of India, not the construction of the Indian state and state institutions.
That's it, Professor Babon, and your sociological input on this important event is certainly very, very important for us as lay people. At the same time, global community I'm talking about, but at the same time, it's a wonderful insight for sociologists how they look at particular possibilities, happenings, and events, and how their interpretations must happen. So this is one of the professional with high level of dexterity, your perception, and it's really attractive and a learning for us that we as upcoming sociologists must adapt to this kind of pattern and mental way of thinking. So thank you, thanks a lot once again in responding this question. So now I would like to move on to my fifth question. We want to have it differently because RISO holds a view that, of course, it's a wonderful government, a wonderful possibilities Narendra Modi ji is trying to sort of implement, but we see a kind of recruitment process is little flawed, not exactly little, but there is tremendous flaw sometimes, strictly higher education. So that's a different perception. We hold that, but we would like to have your views on a very important topic. It's like university internationalization strategy. Could you please throw light on that?
India, like many developing countries, is pursuing an internationalization strategy that focuses on bringing some of the world's top universities to India to set up branch campuses. I personally think this is unlikely to yield the kind of success India is looking for. Again, from a comparative perspective, it's not yielded those dividends anywhere else. Pratap Mehta wrote an excellent article for the Indian Express earlier this year about the fact that international campuses everywhere have had to be subsidized by the government. India does not in any way suggest that it will subsidize international universities coming to India. But if it doesn't subsidize them, what's the benefit for international universities? In theory, these are supposed to be profit-making ventures for those international universities. They'll serve the Indian market, and by doing so, begin to repatriate income to their home countries. That's certainly how internationalization is portrayed in Australia, that Australian universities are going to India, and in fact, as of time of recording, 2 Australian universities have already announced their openings of campuses in India. One, Deakin University in the Delhi area, and the other, University of Wollongong in Gujarat Gift City. Both of those are intended to be financially profitable branch campuses by the universities. But they're missing the fact that Indians simply can't pay sufficient tuition to justify delivering education at a similar level that it's delivered in Western countries. So inevitably, these branch campuses will provide a lower quality education than is provided in other countries. And of course, they'll come without the work permission. So many Indians study abroad in part to gain work experience, working in developed countries like Australia and the United States. Often the work experience is more valuable than the degree itself. So branch campuses in India are not going to receive a subsidy. They're not going to have top academics teaching at them because the universities can't afford to pay top academics to be there. They won't conduct research because, again, research is very expensive. It's generally supported by the government. We tend to believe that research is paid for by the student fees, but in fact, most research is paid for by government subsidies, at least here in Australia and in the United States. In the United States, it's a combination of government subsidies and private philanthropy. So there's no model for these branch campuses to really do anything useful for India. I think there's a disconnect between what India wants from them and what the universities themselves want. Universities believe that there's some pot of gold in India that they can exploit as a quote-unquote market. The Indian government seems to believe that there's an opportunity to bring some of the best global practice to India. Unfortunately, neither of those is likely to happen. The money's not there for the universities to make a profit, and they're not going to send their best academics to India, which means that there's going to be no transfer of knowledge. Probably the best way forward for India to internationalize is to encourage top Indian university, or really any Indian university, it doesn't have to be a top one, to partner with foreign universities on things like international exchange. So, for example, a university in India could have an exchange program where it hosts 30 Australian students, 100 American students, every year, gives them a mix of bespoke classes designed just for those students, but also having those international students in ordinary Indian classes to provide both an educational experience for the visiting student who learns about a new culture, but also provides necessary or really important financial support for the Indian university. Since if an Indian university could charge a Stanford University price to host Stanford University students for one semester. Well, that would be a fantastic advantage to the Indian University, which can then provide those Stanford students with an incredible educational experience, maybe not as technically sophisticated as in Palo Alto, but can give them access to a cultural world that's not available in California. So the right way to do internationalization is via exchange programs, not branch campuses. And I think it's really unfortunate that India's gone down this road when we've seen that this road has not worked in China. It's only worked in Singapore as long as the government was subsidizing it. It only works in the Persian Gulf as long as governments subsidize it. I think I really don't have much positive to say about the current strategy for internationalization.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Bebo, on responding these important five questions, like talking about Indian democracy and about the intellectuals' narratives, misleading narratives about like India being fascist state and different topics. We've talked about his leadership, Narendra Modi leadership, his recession portrayal, which is not exactly a real one. Then you've talked about Rama and their consecration as a sociological possibility, and then university internationalization. You've talked about such a great body of data you've shared with us, quantitative and qualitative, certainly informative, and I'm sure the audience would certainly draw major chunk of benefits by listening to your perceptions, your comments, and as you're already familiar, I think to an extent that RESO is a platform where we sort of try to maintain a record sociology, maintaining a database, quantitative and qualitative as well, for academics and research. And our major intention, a kind of focus, is to help people around across the globe by listening to different experts from different domains. It may not be just sociology, we cover every domain, but our main intention is to sort of, hone up our understanding as a global society on vital topics across the globe where we can make a better society into an existential possibility. Thanks a lot, Professor Bebo, joining us from Australia, Sydney. Thank you so much for giving your precious time, sir. Thank you, sir.
Namaskar.
Namaskar, sir.